Depression doesn't always look like crying. It doesn't always look like staying in bed all day, or saying the words, "I'm depressed" out loud. Sometimes it looks like something much quieter. It looks like the friend who used to text you memes every morning and now just says "hey" once a week. It looks like the coworker who used to volunteer for every project and now does the bare minimum, on time, every time, without complaint. It looks like you, scrolling your phone for 40 minutes before you can convince yourself to get out of bed, even though nothing is technically wrong. That's the strange thing about depression. It rarely announces itself. Instead, it moves into your daily routines quietly, one small adjustment at a time, until the adjustments become the new normal. And because they become normal, you stop questioning them. You explain them away. I'm just tired. I'm just busy. I've just gotten more introverted. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes those explanations are a kind of camouflage, hiding something your mind hasn't fully named yet. In this video, we're going to walk through 7 subtle behavioral signs that researchers and clinicians associate with depression, the kind that hide inside habits rather than announcing themselves as sadness. We'll look at the psychological mechanism behind why depression shows up this way instead of as obvious distress. And then we'll cover practical, research-backed strategies for building the kind of self-awareness that catches these patterns early, along with a clear sense of when it's time to bring in professional support. Before we go further, one important note. This video is for education and self-reflection, not diagnosis. Depression is a clinical condition, and only a licensed professional can properly assess it. What we're offering here is a map, not a verdict. A way of noticing patterns in yourself or people you care about, so you can ask better questions and get the right kind of help sooner. So why does depression hide in habits instead of showing up as visible sadness? The answer has to do with how the brain manages energy and motivation. Depression is strongly linked to changes in the brain's reward circuitry, particularly a neurotransmitter system involving dopamine, which plays a central role in motivation, anticipation, and the drive to engage with the world. When this system is disrupted, the result isn't necessarily feeling sad in a dramatic way. It's often a flattening. Things that used to feel rewarding, a good meal, a phone call with a friend, finishing a project, simply stop generating the same internal payoff. Psychologists call this reduced capacity to feel pleasure, anhedonia, and it's considered one of the 2 core symptoms of clinical depression, alongside low mood. Here's the key insight. When reward signals go quiet, behavior quietly follows. You don't consciously decide to withdraw from friends. You just notice that reaching out feels like more effort than it's worth, so you don't. You don't consciously decide to stop caring about your hobbies. You just notice one day that you haven't picked up the guitar in 3 months, and you can't quite explain why. The behavior changes first, often before the person has words for what's happening internally. That's why depression can hide in plain sight, inside routines that look on the surface like laziness or busyness, or simply a phase. This is also why depression is sometimes called an invisible illness, even to the person experiencing it. Our culture has a very specific image of what depression is supposed to look like. Someone who is visibly tearful, who talks openly about hopelessness, who struggles to get out of bed. That image is accurate for some people, but it leaves out a much larger group whose depression expresses itself as a kind of low hum in the background of daily life. Functional but flattened. Present but disengaged. Understanding the mechanism, this quiet erosion of reward and motivation, helps explain why the signs we're about to cover often masquerade as personality traits or lifestyle choices rather than symptoms. Let's walk through 7 of them. The first is social withdrawal that feels justified. Not avoiding people because of a conflict or a bad mood, but a gradual thinning of contact that always has a reasonable explanation attached. You're tired. You have too much on your plate. You'll reach out next week. Researchers who study depression describe this pattern as behavioral withdrawal, and it tends to be self-reinforcing. The less you engage, the less rewarding engagement feels when you finally attempt it, which makes you withdraw further. The second sign is chronic procrastination on things you actually care about. not just avoiding chores, but delaying the things that used to matter to you, like a creative project, a career goal, or a personal milestone. This isn't simple laziness. It often reflects the anticipation deficit we mentioned earlier. If your brain isn't generating the usual anticipatory reward for finishing something meaningful, the motivation to start it in the first place quietly disappears. The third sign is a loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities, sometimes called anhedonia in clinical language. This is one of the most well-documented markers of depression, and it's often the most confusing to notice from the inside, because the activity itself hasn't changed. The hike is the same hike. The recipe is the same recipe. What's changed is your internal response to it. The fourth sign is disrupted sleep patterns that don't match your schedule, either sleeping far more than usual as a way of escaping wakeful hours, or lying awake with a mind that won't quiet down. Sleep and mood share tightly linked biological pathways, and disruptions in one reliably affect the other. The fifth sign is a change in appetite or eating patterns, again in either direction, eating considerably more or considerably less than usual, often without a clear cause like illness or a new diet. The sixth sign is difficulty concentrating on tasks that used to be manageable, losing your train of thought mid-sentence, rereading the same paragraph 3 times, or feeling a kind of mental fog that coffee doesn't fix. And the seventh sign is a persistent, low-grade, self-critical inner voice, one that frames ordinary mistakes as evidence of some deeper personal failing, rather than as normal parts of being human. None of these 7 signs, on its own, means someone is depressed. Everybody procrastinates sometimes. Everybody has a bad night's sleep or an off week socially. The distinction clinicians look for isn't the presence of one sign. It's a cluster of these changes, persisting for 2 weeks or more, representing a real shift from how that person used to function. That's the threshold researchers use, and it's a useful one to borrow for your own self-reflection. So, how do you actually build the kind of self-awareness that catches these patterns early, especially when, as we discussed, the whole nature of this kind of depression is that it hides inside routines you've stopped questioning? Here are 2 core techniques that psychologists and behavioral researchers point to again and again. The first technique is habit tracking, sometimes called behavioral monitoring in clinical settings. The idea is simple. Instead of relying on memory or mood to tell you how you're doing, which is notoriously unreliable when your baseline has shifted gradually, you track a small set of concrete daily behaviors. Things like, did I contact a friend or family member today? Did I do any physical activity? Did I do something I usually enjoy? How many hours did I sleep? You don't need a special app for this. A simple notebook or a notes file works fine. The value isn't in the tracking itself, it's in the comparison over time. Because depression creeps in gradually, a single day tells you almost nothing. But 2 weeks of data laid out side by side can reveal a pattern your day-to-day awareness completely missed. The way a photograph taken every day for a month can reveal a haircut growing out in a way you'd never notice in the mirror each morning. This connects to a broader concept in psychology called the boiling frog pattern of gradual change. Our minds are excellent at detecting sudden shifts, but remarkably poor at detecting slow ones, because each day only differs slightly from the day before it. Habit tracking essentially outsources that detection to something more objective than your own shifting sense of normal. The second technique is what therapists sometimes call values-based check-ins. Once a week, ask yourself a specific question. What did I do this week that actually reflected what matters to me? Not what I was productive at, not what I was obligated to do, but what genuinely aligned with my values, whether that's connection, creativity, growth, or contribution. If the honest answer is consistently not much, that's worth paying attention to. This technique works because it bypasses the vague, hard-to-answer question, am I happy? Which depression itself can distort, and replaces it with something more concrete and harder to rationalize away. A third insight worth adding here is about how to interpret what you find. The goal of tracking and reflecting isn't to generate guilt or to turn self-awareness into another form of self-criticism, which, remember, is one of the 7 signs we just covered. The goal is information. If you notice a pattern, 2 or 3 weeks of reduced contact with others, disrupted sleep, and a flattened response to things you usually enjoy, treat that the way you'd treat a warning light on a car's dashboard. It's not a moral failing, it's data, and it's telling you it might be time to check in with a professional. This brings us to the question of when self-awareness should turn into professional support. A reasonable guideline, drawn from how clinicians actually screen for depression, is this. If several of these signs have been present most days for 2 weeks or longer, and they're affecting your work, your relationships, or your ability to function the way you used to, that's a strong signal to talk to a doctor or a licensed mental health professional. You don't need to wait until things feel unbearable to justify getting help. In fact, catching these patterns early, while they still look like just a rough patch, is exactly when treatment tends to be most effective. And if at any point you notice thoughts of hopelessness that feel heavier than ordinary sadness, or thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore, please reach out to a professional or a crisis line immediately. Support exists, and reaching out is a sign of strength, not weakness. Depression is remarkably good at disguising itself as personality, as circumstance, as just being tired lately. That's not a character flaw in the people it affects. It's simply how the condition tends to operate, quietly reshaping behavior before it ever announces itself in words. The 7 signs we covered today: withdrawing, procrastinating on things you care about, losing interest, disrupted sleep, changes in appetite, trouble concentrating, and a harsher inner voice, aren't a diagnostic checklist. They're an invitation to look a little more closely at the routines you've stopped questioning, and to ask, with curiosity rather than judgment, whether they're still serving you. If this video helped you see your own habits, or someone else's, a little more clearly, consider subscribing. We put out new videos every week exploring the psychology hiding in plain sight, in your habits, your relationships, and your everyday decisions. Understanding your own mind is one of the most valuable things you can invest in, and I'd love to have you along for the next one. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourself.